I'm the Curator of Community and Academic Programs here at the Biggs Museum of American Art. Today we are located on the 3rd floor in our American Impressionism Gallery. And today I'll be taking you through the gallery, through a selection of artwork that I think really encapsulates what is Impressionism art in America and kind of gives us a good example of the types of skills and styles that can be seen here in the gallery. So please know that we are not looking at every single artwork. We're going to be looking at a selection chosen for this. So first up, what is Impressionism? If you're joining us, there's a good chance you have some understanding of Impressionism or art, but in case you don't, we're going to get into that a little bit, which is also why I've chosen the piece here to start, even though it is a smaller artwork. First and foremost, Impressionism. Impressionism is an artistic movement that really started in 1860 in France, and it got its name from an artist in France at that time period. But what was just told to me that I completely forgot, I'm so sorry, is how to use Zoom. We've been doing this for so long that I completely forgot. Not everyone knows how we do it here. So during this tour that we're going to be taking, if you have any questions, we have our curator, Ryan, who will be manning the questions and the behind the scenes. So you may see him pop on screen. So if you have questions, you want to type them into the chat box. To do that, you want to hover your mouse over the screen, and either coming from the top or from the bottom, you'll have a little banner pop up, and chat will be one of them. You just want to type your question into there, and Ryan will be monitoring the questions, and we'll have a question period at the end where I will be answering your questions. So please let us know if you have anything as we go on. If it's an immediate question, you may see Ryan flash on screen, or just post a response if it's something like, who is that artist? When was that done? Something very pertinent to that exact moment. Otherwise, your questions will be read and curated at the end by our curator, Ryan. So getting back into the tour. Sorry, I forgot that at the beginning. Getting back into the tour. What is Impressionism? Impressionism is a style of art beginning in the 1860s in France. It's a typically French style of art that became very popular all across Europe and the US. Impressionism gets its name from a Monet painting called Impression Sunrise. And this painting is an extremely loose wash of color. It looks like it's been done very quickly, and it really sort of dissolves the scene. You don't get a good delineation between the water and the sky. You just have a muddle of a bluish orange carrying across the page with quick dark strokes creating minor waves and ripples from some boatmen going out on the river. So that was so different at the time that that name gets coined by a journalist and is called Impressionism, and it becomes the name of this movement because the artists were very interested in capturing a quick impression of a scene. They want to capture a moment. I really like to think of Impressionism as the very first version of Instagram, in that these artists weren't painting anything metaphorical, which was really popular at the time. You get a lot of metaphorical stories, you get a lot of fantasies, or really very detailed everyday life. Here with Impressionism, they're trying to capture these quick fleeting moments. They often have movement involved in them, people dancing, singing, or otherwise, such as the painting here, they are outdoor scenes. Now, one of the things that allowed this style of art to really get that impression of an area or a scene is because of how fast these artists typically worked. These artists would work quickly and they would do something unique, and that is they would let the colors blend on the canvas. So instead of being inside a studio and carefully mixing every single shade that they were going to use and laying it flat on the canvas, they would take their paint, they would take a palette knife and they would quickly pick up multiple colors, and they would use their palette knife or brush and apply it onto the canvas, often leaving a lot of texture and letting those colors in their true hue form sort of vibrate off each other. Now, one of the reasons they did that is because Impressionists are very interested in capturing how light affects color. They want to know, rather than using blacks and browns and dark greens to create shadow, they want to capture the actual light reflecting off colors. And so they want the truest form of the color, the most unblended color, and let those line up next to each other to react to create a shadow. If that doesn't make sense right now, that's okay. You'll see it in action as we get closer to these paintings. But before we get close, one more thing about Impressionism that needs to be acknowledged. This is a revolutionary art style in the late 1800s, and the true reason behind that is because of technological advancements. Before Impressionism starts and before the Industrial Revolution, artists, and more often than not their assistants, had to hand mix their own pigments. So this required typically a source of pigment, whether that's a shell, a stone, a plant, clay, anything like that, to be crushed down and added to a binder. Either oil or egg tends to be the popular ones. And so it took a lot of effort, it took a lot of materials, it was potentially very messy for a small amount of paint. During the Industrial Revolution, people got interested in chemistry, got interested in mechanics, and all sorts of science. And what happens is, instead of having to go out and find bones and crush up bones, they were able to chemically make a white pigment in a factory and bottle it. So that allowed artists to take a bunch of little bottles, just like you see people today, put them in a bag with their paintbrushes and a palette, and grab a traveling easel and whatever they were using and go outside. And that is called plein air. And that is what is truly going on with these Impressionists. Many of them are going on site. They are painting the scenes as they actually happen, which is why I like to think of them as the early form of Instagram, because it's the same as the Instagram models, just kind of going out and taking pictures of all the places they've been to capture the feel. That's what these artists are doing. So to help explain this, we have this painting here. This is a painting by William Merritt Chase called Haystacks. Now we're going to go ahead and get closer to this painting. Cool, so we're going to get closer to this painting. This is Haystacks by William Merritt Chase. And I have chosen to start with this painting because in many regards, it's quintessential Impressionism. This piece was painted by the artist William Merritt Chase, as I said, in 1881 at the peak of Impressionism, and is entitled Haystacks. After studying in Munich, Chase joined an organization specifically about painting ceramic tiles, and this was called the Tile Club. The Tile Club would go on annual sketching trips to upstate New York and Long Island, and it was during these trips between 1879 and 1881 that he tried his hand at plein air painting. So it's believed that Haystacks was created during A New York trip of 1881, with similar scenes appearing in works created by other Tile Club members. His use of a tonal palette here also suggests this because it demonstrates the most vibrant hues that were specifically denoted to French Impressionism practices. So if we get up close to this painting, we can really start to see how the brush strokes are piling together. So you can see there's a lot of texture, and this is something very keen with the Impressionism movement, because you can see, like right here, you can see the actual brush strokes where he's taken a white and a light purple and has just pressed it onto the canvas around that blue. And that's how he's making these clouds and these scenes. And it looks like almost an early morning with the clouds coming up and the mist coming up off the ground. And yet from far away, it clearly looks like haystacks with someone in the field. But when you go closer, the haystacks and the figures just disappear into brush strokes. And as we go on, we'll see paintings where this is much more exaggerated than it is here. So William Merritt Chase was a prolific American impressionist and teacher, most notable for his figurative portraits, which in 1876 won him a medal at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition and garnered him fame. Chase studied and worked in a variety of locations, such as New York, St. Louis, Missouri, the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich, in Venice, Italy, and finally returning to New York, he established himself at the famed 10th Street Studios, which is actually pictured here in this second work. So the 10th Street Studio building revolutionized how artists lived. Give us 1 second, we're having some technical issues. Are we good? Sorry about that, just 1 second. So sorry, we're gonna go a little bit handheld right now. Our original camera has died. Are we good? All right, so what I was saying was William Merritt Chase studied and traveled all over the world, and where he finally settled down is gonna be in the famed 10th Street Studios in New York, which is pictured here. This was painted by a student of his named Reynolds Beale, who was one of Chase's few private students and who also worked alongside Chase in 10th Street Studio. So 10th Street Studio was revolutionary because it is the first time that artists are not having to work inside cramped studios if they were separated from a home. So I'll explain that a little bit more. During the 18th and 19th centuries, artists primarily lived and worked out of what was called studio homes that looked very similar to this 10th Street Studio. These were often large houses that had immense studios attached. And these homes, well, they were pretty much designed as first and foremost entertaining spaces. And artists would have regular at-homes, which is where their studios would be open for people to come and look at art, to visit, to talk to the artist, to buy art, and as a whole, to take in the artistic milieu. In the mid-1800s, studios separate from homes began being established, but these spaces were often dark, cold, and lacked proper windows. Completed in 1857, the 10th Street Studios mimicked the grandeur of studio homes and was the first multiple artist studio built in the States. 10th Street held 25 studios organized around a central atrium with a glass ceiling. The painting here depicts William Merritt Chase's 10th Street studio. And as I said before, it was painted by Reynolds Beale, who worked under Chase in the Art Students League in the late 1890s. Beale had the privilege of becoming a private student of Chase on site in the 10th Street studio. So in this painting, we see depicted the height of Gilded Age aesthetic grandeur. So for example, as I said, this is going to mimic the home studios that were popular and were sort of a signifier of wealth. But in here, what we have is a collection of aesthetic pieces. Both selections of artwork are shown. Often these would be for sale, painted by the artist of whoever studio this is, so in this case Chase, which is why we have a lot of portraits and figural drawings. That's what he was most famous for, were his figural drawings. Also in here, this studio space would be used as an area to pose his figures. So in here we have our seating area that may be used not only for entertaining and for people to sit and talk and feel like they're part of the art world, but also oftentimes these benches would be used to pose and prop people who he was painting. In this place as well, we have all sorts of signifiers of high artistic style. So for example, we have this Japanese parasol coming up. During this period, we have what is called Orientalizing happening. So the United States has initiated trade with the East. And what's happening is there's a large influx of Japanese artworks and culture, and the Americans are devouring it. They want everything that has to do with the East. And they sort of blend what exactly the East is, and China, Japan, and India, and even as far as the Middle East, all kind of just becomes the East. And it's all thrown into the same Orientalized category as far as art goes in this period. So he has the very fashionable Japanese parasol. He also has different sort of pieces that symbolize travel throughout Europe. You have Middle Eastern lamps hanging down that have sort of a Gothic feel to them as well. It's often a blend between it. And you have the paper lanterns coming down, and even hanging up where this canvas is coming up to create the sitting area, we have a shield that looks sort of Norse or Viking or medieval, which would also be extremely high in fashion in this time period. In fact, what we think of as Vikings today, the braids and the helmets with the two horns, those are coming out of the Victorian period. Before that, there was really a distancing from Vikings because of the pillaging, and they participated in a lot of slave trade. There's really a distancing from that culture, but during this period, because of sort of the mass expansion of different empires, a rekindling of that sort of joy in the culture of expansion from a positive light is kind of how they thought of it. You get a resurgence of interest in Vikings, which denotes sort of this area in the center here. Of course, then going over to the side, you have more of what you would consider traditional artistic milieu. You have in here, if you get really close, you can see a ship in the background. You can see different pieces of pottery. And then you can see replicated statues. Even as much as the head of Caracalla. That little piece was so famous during the turn of the century that it became a staple for artists to have either a bust of Caracalla or of other Roman sort of generals that they had. But this particular one, from the angle, we can tell that it's Caracalla. Again, just highlighting travel, highlighting trade. We have a Greek protection eye happening here as well. We also then have another fashionable symbol leaning back towards the Mediterranean, which is going to be the shot silk curtain. And you can tell it's a shot silk curtain, which is, shot silk is a fabric that the stitching has been woven in two different directions. So it's two different colors. So for example, the yellowish, the stitching may be going vertically, and the orange may be running horizontally. So when different light hits it, it sort of changes colors. This was super fashionable in Italy in the Renaissance and has a resurgence again in the Gilded Age. Now, a question had been posed before of what's behind the door. Behind the door would have been the entrance to the glass ceilinged atrium and the other studios. So just as a reminder, this is a separate studio at 10th Street Studios, where there were 25 artists sort of based off a central atrium. So, talking about fashion farther, we're going to turn our attention to human fashion, getting out of the social fashion and the visual representations. We're going to turn our attention now to our depiction of a new woman. So this is one of our most popular pieces in the museum, and it is called Summer Girl. Yeah. So I'm just gonna, before we start talking about this, this is a great piece when we get closer to it to really look at up close. Because from far away from where you are, her skin tone looks as if it's sort of a natural tan color. Fairly pale, but a tan color. Whereas up close, there is almost no tan in her face. There's almost no peach color. Her skin is really made up out of pastels, blues, pinks, yellows. There's even a little bit of green to make her skin tone. And that's something that gets really big in this period, where you're using multiple colors to create one thing. So even her purple shirt isn't just purple, it's blues, it's yellows, it's reds, it's violets. Yeah, I was gonna list more colors, but you can see them yourself. So continuing on the idea of the height of fashion, we're going to turn our attention to the new woman. As I said, this is one of our most popular pieces, Summer Girl, and it's painted by the artist Robert Reed. Robert Reed had established himself as one of the masters of American Impressionism by the end of the 19th century. He trained at the school of the MFA Boston and then transferred to the Art Students League that Chase was a part of teaching, and then transferred to the Académie Julian in Paris, where he exhibited art at both the Paris Salon and in New York. In the 1890s, he developed the theme he would become most recognizable for and that we see here, which is the new woman. He painted pictures of women, typically outside, typically surrounded by flowers, often naming his paintings after the flowers in the paintings. So the new woman is evolving out of a period where the ideal female figure was modeled on one suffering from consumption, with pallid skin, sunken eyes, red lips, small frames, and a tight wasp waist, and often adorned with layers of heavy fabrics covering ankles to wrists. The new woman emerged towards the turn of the 20th century. One who appeared sure of herself rather than demure and was seen as full-figured by comparison. This means that they had a natural waist and wore freer clothing. Reed depicts the young woman here as he did many others outside with flowers. This type of imagery is a huge change from earlier depictions of women in the 19th century, where, as I said, they were often meek looking, they were often confined to interior scenes or fictional settings, as we explored in my Gilded Age tour a couple weeks ago. Reed's women, however, were ultimately a project and a depiction of an all-American girl in the style of New Woman, exhibiting determination, modernity, and an informal attitude. This is present throughout her depiction. She appears to be casually leaning on a porch banister as she watches something beyond the viewer, which I'll return to that point in a minute. Her sleeve is pushed up as if she were just working with her hands, and her wide brim hat highlights an afternoon outside, a strict departure from women of the early 19th century. What must be noticed here is amongst Reed's loose brushstrokes that we looked at closer before, and the bold colors is the ferocity of freedom presented in this image, and I will leave it up to you as to whether or not that freedom is sexualized or celebrated. Because perhaps overlooked by modern viewers is her exposed elbow, which would have been seen as risque, something similar to a very high dress slit today or a deep plunging neckline. Also, we, as the viewer, are located beneath Summer Girl and are looking up at her, and in return, she sticks her non-bustled backside in our face as if she doesn't meet our gaze. So there's a play here between the traditional male gaze of the painter, because he was a man. So there's the play of the male gaze where the painter is a man looking at a woman who is not looking at him. So in some senses, she is a subject and not a real human who's being sexualized because, as I said, exposed elbow. And also she's turning, displaying her booty for us. Whereas simultaneously, she's not looking at the viewer, so she has no connection with us. But here, it could also be seen as a celebration because we as a viewer are below, looking upward at her, so she's elevated above the viewer, and therefore isn't looking past us, but beyond us and above us. And so there's the play of she doesn't need to notice you. Which has to do with this freedom idea that was all about the New Women movement. Now, Reed, while he was a prolific artist, was not actually part of an artistic community, which is what we're going to explore in the next painting beside it. So you can get an idea of how large these paintings are, starting from our very small Haystacks originally. So we're going to turn our attention to this next painting, which is depicting an artist community in Massachusetts. So this is entitled Boats at Low Tide. There we go. So as I said, while Reed was not a member of any artistic communities, there were many, and one such community is depicted in this painting. As I said, Boats at Low Tide. Forgive me as I checked my notes on that. By Edward Henry Pothouse. This painting depicts the artist colony of Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is hard to say together, forgive me, by Cape Ann. He was a student of what would become the Academy of Art in Cincinnati before going to both Munich and Paris. He was the only American to be exhibited in the contemporary Impressionist art exhibition in the Cincinnati Museum of Art. And he's highly influenced by the Spanish painter Joaquin Soria de Bastida. And because of that, Pothouse really focuses his work on beach scenes like this. What's really unique about this particular artwork is that you have these wide brush strokes that we've been showing that was really highlighted in Reed's painting. But as you get closer, you get a lot of detail in this painting that you don't necessarily get even in Haystacks, but certainly not in Summer Girl. So as we get closer, you'll notice there's a lot of play happening with the reflections in this water, even being able to possibly give us more detail than we get in the real painting. And as we're looking closer, you can see the delineation of woodwork on the bottom of the boat. So these rapid brush strokes are much smaller and tighter than many of the other Impressionists in this gallery, creating an image that, as you can see, stays together well as you get close to the canvas. You don't lose what you're looking at the same way you do in Summer Girl and in many other pieces in this collection here. Also, unlike many Impressionists on display here, Potthast often uses softer, less bold colors to create a more subtle hue. So it's a little more realistic. This is low tide. We can see the tans happening. Even though if you get close, you can see those tans are made of purples and blues and pinks and greens, not browns. But you still get a more natural color than you get in even Summer Girl, for example. So he uses a less bold color to create a more subtle hue and a more tonal subject on the canvas. As I said, highlighting that we even get more detail in the reflection than we do in the original object. Yeah. So as we get in, as you can see when you got closer to this piece, there is a lot of depth and texture in this particular work of art. I love to highlight this boat in the corner because you can't even up close, you can't quite tell what's happening here other than it's the back of a boat. And these are just made with very thick brush strokes. So the way he did that is he piled up the paint on his brush and then just did a stroke. And you can even see where he's then changed direction to add another one onto the canvas. But for the Impressionist period and Impressionist artists, this would have been seen as unheard of in the art world. They wanted flat canvases that had a lot of tiny pre-made colors that went together to create almost a photorealistic scene. However, because in this period we have the invention of photography, people could just go out and photograph the scene. There was no longer this need for artists to be so exact with their images. In fact, you have a lot of play back and forth and tons of dissertations, many by the art critic Reynolds, about what is art, what is photography, and how they relate to each other. So Impressionism, you have to think of as in dialogue with photography. It's a reaction to photography. If photography can go out and capture the scene with exact realness, what is there for an artist to do? An artist can do color. They can look at color, they can look at movement, they can look at capturing the sounds of the water in their painting. As we look at this, we can sort of hear the quiet sort of rush out of the waves at low tide. And you can sort of hear the birds by looking at this painting and the way that the brushstrokes are going. And that's what's interesting and what makes Impressionist artwork so fascinating to watch, is it's a response to the photography being done in this period. Like I said, think of it as a filter on Instagram. I'm going to keep coming back to it. Impressionist artists, the original Instagram users. So we're going to keep with this sort of beach scene, and we're going to turn to my absolute favorite work in the entire collection that is on display. I have to say that because I haven't gone through the whole not on display yet. And we're going to turn our attention to this painting up here. I will stay out of frame because it will be really hard for me to be in frame without climbing on top of artwork. This painting is called Heavy Surf by Frederick Jagua. So as I said, keeping with our water and our look at water, we're turning our attention to waves crashing in the ocean. Waugh was born in New Jersey to artist parents. Both his mother and his father were artists. He studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts and then studied in Paris under the renowned artist Adolphe William Bergerou. So that's the famous artist who did almost life-size romantic paintings of people. He was quite famous and very different in style than Waugh was. So after studying in Paris under Bergerou, he worked and traveled back and forth between Europe and Philadelphia. He eventually discovered he loved painting sort of this rocky coastline and eventually settled on the English coast on the isolated island of Sark, which is where this painting is set. And that's where he would paint the majority of his paintings from that point on. Now, what I love most about this piece is what he was critically acclaimed for. And that was making water actually have emotion. He captured the emotion of water as if it were a living creature or a living piece in his artwork, which I guess in some respects it is. So that's what I love about this, is because you can sort of feel the energy of the water itself. You have your different layers of blue, ranging in depth and hinting at just the unknown of this ocean, as it then crashes up on these rocks. And we are seated as the viewer on these rocks as the water crashes up upon us. So it's a very engaging scene. We're partaking in this ocean that looks as if it's on the edge of a storm. And now what I want to point out in this painting is the rocks. So if we get really close to where the waves are crashing on the rocks, we can see there's a ton of texture. And that's part of the reason I love this, is not only do we get all of the different colors, these rocks have greens and reds and yellows and browns and some gray, some blue in it. And the waves are blues. They're blues and greens and yellows, not just white. But as we get close to the rocks here, we can see that after these layers have been applied, Waugh has actually taken either the back of a paintbrush or taken a palette knife and has just carved almost arbitrary texture into these rocks. Rather than just following a form in a line, he's just kind of cross-hatched his way through these, creating a very interesting play between a very 3D scene with a high perspective and with a lot of movement. And the rocks themselves are very detailed in their angles to be 3D, and then has just laid almost a flat pattern on it, creating a play between the perspectives. So as we wind down, we're going to go to our last piece, because I could probably talk about that one alone for about an hour. So, if you have questions, want to know more, feel free to type them in. We're going to turn to our very last piece. This is a local artist, Ethel Leach, of a local scene, Rehoboth Beach. And that rhymed. You're welcome. So this painting here is called The Pines in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Now, Ethel Leach was a local artist in this area, and she used to spend the spring through the autumn in Rehoboth Beach, surrounded by these pines, and she really just fell in love with them. Now, this painting is extremely late for an Impressionist piece. This painting is from 1957. And one of the reasons I chose this piece is, even though it is long beyond what's considered the end of the Impressionism movement, this style was still continuing. And this piece, even though it's late, has all of the quintessential artistic characteristics of Impressionism. For example, you can see those quick brushstrokes. This is a plein air piece. And you can see how black really isn't used. All of our shading is made by having true hue colors, so straight out of the bottle colors, stacked next to each other and sort of vibrating to give us the brightness, to give us the movement. Now, Ethel Leach was an illustrator, and we can see her drawing heavily on that knowledge when creating this piece. Because very similarly to Jaguar, we are located in the scene. This is painted at eye level for the average person standing on this path in the woods. So we have our trees going up above our view as just the average person and sort of teetering back. But she wants to give us this idea of movement through the painting. Whereas Frederick Jaguar has the water coming to us and sort of coming up in front of us as we're seated on rocks. Here, we're standing on a pathway. that rather than going straight, which would give us a finite point to travel to, weaves its way through the forest, through the sunlights, letting us hit pieces of shade, pieces of light, and creating sort of a narrative ballet, if you will, through these pines and giving them this life and warmth with hidden details inside of it, such as there's quite a few birds, actually. There's some birds flying. There's a red bird sitting in a tree. And as I said, giving us all of these different options of ways we could travel through the pines without giving us a finite thing to look at. So sort of playing with this idea of being there in person, which is very unique to her and to illustration itself. So in conclusion, wrapping up, we've looked at Impressionism as a whole. As you can see, even just peeking out behind this canvas, there are many more pieces of art in this room that we haven't discussed, and we being me, I have not discussed. So there's always more to come back and see. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box, and I will do my best to answer them. And I hope you have enjoyed this tour. Feel free to check us out. This is a regular occurring every other Tuesday tour. You either do tours or lectures throughout the year. You sign up for the same way you did for this one. And please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you've enjoyed your evening.